Mechanic comforts crying girl in wheelchair. Unknowingly, the factory owner's daughter. David Johnson was finishing another double shift when he heard desperate crying coming from the factory yard. His first instinct was to ignore it. He already had enough problems without getting involved in drama. But something in that sound of sorrow made him pause. That's when he saw the girl, a blonde child, no older than 12, sitting in a black wheelchair with tears streaming down her face as she clutched a crumpled photo in her trembling hands. "Hey, little one, what are you doing here?" David approached slowly, removing his sweaty blue cap. The girl looked up with red, puffy eyes. Her delicate face was marked by a sadness far too heavy for someone so young. I was looking for my dad," she managed between sobs. "But they sent me away. Said I couldn't stay here." David's heart clenched. He'd seen plenty of injustice in his life, but a child being mistreated always made his blood boil. "Who sent you away?" he asked, kneeling beside the wheelchair. "The lady from the office. She yelled at me, said I didn't belong here, and that they'd call someone to remove me." The girl wiped her nose with the sleeve of her beige blouse. "I just wanted to talk to my dad." "And your dad works here?" She nodded and showed him the photo she was holding. It was an old, faded picture of a young man smiling beside a beautiful woman. David looked closer and his stomach dropped. He recognized that face, but the man in the photo seemed worlds apart from the current owner of Liberty Steelworks, where he'd worked for 5 years. "What's your dad's name?" David asked, keeping his voice steady. "Richard Anderson," she whispered. "My mom always said he worked at a big factory, but she never took me to see him. Now that she can't take me anywhere, I decided to come alone." David swallowed hard. Richard Anderson was the factory owner, the man who signed his contracts and whom he occasionally saw walking the halls in expensive suits, always stern and distant. He'd never imagined that successful businessmen had a daughter, let alone a disabled one sitting here, abandoned and crying. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Emily. Emily Anderson Johnson, but everyone calls me Em." Just then, David heard firm footsteps approaching. He turned and saw Karen Miller, the factory's administrative manager, storming toward them, her face flushed with anger. "David, what are you doing standing around? Your shift isn't over yet," she shouted, stopping a few feet away, "just helping the girl." David stood but stayed close to Emily. "Helping? That one's a trespasser. I've told her to leave twice already and she keeps coming back. If you don't get back to work right now, you're fired on the spot." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now back to the story. David felt anger rising in his chest. He looked at Emily, who had started crying silently again, then at Karen with her rigid posture and cold glare. "No job is worth more than a child's dignity," he said firmly, crossing his arms. Karen's eyes widened, not expecting defiance. "Excuse me? Are you challenging me?" "I'm saying this girl isn't bothering anyone. She just wants to find her father." "Father?" Karen let out a sarcastic laugh. "She's just another beggar who shows up here every day. You're so naive, David." "I'm not a beggar," Emily shouted, startling everyone. "My dad works here. His name is Richard Anderson." Karen's face changed instantly. For a second, David saw something like recognition in her eyes, but she quickly masked it. "Any lunatic can make up any story," she said, but her voice was less steady. "David, last chance. Go back to work or pack your things and leave." David looked at Emily again. The girl watched him with hopeful eyes, as if he were the only person in the world willing to believe her. He thought of his own daughter, Olivia, who was about the same age, and how he'd feel if someone treated her that way. "Then I'm leaving," he said simply. Karen's jaw dropped. Clearly, she hadn't expected him to take the threat seriously. "Are you crazy? You're throwing away 5 years of work over this... Watch what you're about to say," David cut in, his voice laced with warning. Meanwhile, other employees began to gather, drawn by the argument. David recognized familiar faces. Old Joe, the doorman who'd been with the company for over 20 years, Sarah from housekeeping, who always had a kind word, and Mike, a new welder who admired David. "What's going on here?" Old Joe asked, eyeing the scene with concern. None of your business, Karen snapped. All of you, get back to work. But Old Joe didn't move. His eyes were fixed on Emily, and David noticed the older man's face had gone pale. Sweetheart, what's your name? Old Joe asked, his voice trembling. Emily Anderson Johnson, she answered, wiping her tears. Old Joe closed his eyes for a moment, as if fighting a painful memory. Karen, he said quietly, you know exactly who this girl is. I don't know what you're talking about, Karen shot back, but David noticed her hands were shaking. Old Joe, David stepped closer to the doorman. Do you know her? The older man sighed deeply. I've known this child since she was born, he admitted, and I also know why she's here. Karen stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger. Joe, shut your mouth. You have no authority to speak about board matters. What board matters? David asked, sensing he was in the middle of something far bigger than he'd imagined. Emily watched them silently, clearly confused by all the tension. She clutched the photo tighter, as if it were her only anchor in the world. Does my dad really work here? She asked in a small voice. Old Joe looked at her with immense sadness. Yes, sweetheart, he does. He owns all of this. The silence that followed was deafening. David felt as if the ground had opened beneath him. Karen was visibly nervous, running her hands through her hair and glancing around as if searching for an escape. Then, why has he never come to see me? Emily asked, her broken voice shattering David's heart. It's complicated, sweetheart, Old Joe said, kneeling before her. Very complicated. Joe, Karen shouted, you're fired! All of you! If you don't leave right now, I'm calling security! Go ahead, David said calmly. I'd love to explain to them why a child is being mistreated here. That's when Mike, who had stayed quiet until then, pulled out his phone. I've been recording everything, he announced, and I'm posting it online. People need to know how kids are treated here. You can't do that. Karen lunged toward him, but David blocked her path. Yes, he can, David said. The sidewalk's public property. At that moment, a black limousine pulled into the factory parking lot. David recognized the boss's car immediately. Richard Anderson had arrived for his routine visit. Emily also saw the car and her eyes lit up. It's him! It's my dad! She shouted, trying to move her wheelchair toward the vehicle. David helped her, pushing the chair while Karen Miller yelled behind them to stop. The limousine parked in the reserved spot, and Richard Anderson stepped out. He was a tall man, around 40 years old, dressed in an impeccable grey suit. He walked hurriedly, as always, staring at his phone and completely ignoring his surroundings. Dad! Emily shouted as loud as she could. Dad, it's me, Emily! Richard stopped for a second, looking around with a confused expression. His eyes quickly passed over David, over Karen running after them, and finally landed on Emily. For a moment, David saw something break in the businessman's face, an expression of pure pain, as if someone had punched him in the gut. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, the expression vanished, replaced by a cold mask. Richard looked away and continued walking toward the main building, completely ignoring his daughter's desperate cries. Dad, please don't leave. Emily was sobbing now, stretching her arms toward the retreating man. I just want to talk to you. David felt a rage he had never experienced before. He let go of the wheelchair for a moment and ran after Richard. Mr. Anderson, he shouted. Sir! Richard turned, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. What is it? He asked coldly. Your daughter is here. She came looking for you. I don't have a daughter, Richard replied without hesitation, but David saw his hands tremble slightly. Of course you do. She's right there in the wheelchair, crying because of you. Richard looked again in Emily's direction, and for a moment it seemed like he might break. But then his face hardened. Get that child out of here, now, or I'll call the authorities. How can you say that? She's your daughter. I said I don't have a daughter, Richard shouted, losing his composure for a second before regaining control. And you're fired. Karen. The manager rushed over, clearly relieved to have the boss's support. Yes, Mr. Anderson. Fire this man immediately, and get that person off the property. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked at Emily, who had stopped crying and was now just watching the scene with an expression of utter devastation. It was as if something inside her had shattered for good. "I see," David said quietly. "I see exactly what kind of man you are." Richard seemed surprised by the calm response. "Excuse me?" "Nothing." David shook his head. "Come on, Emily. Let's get out of here." He returned to the girl and began pushing her wheelchair toward the exit. Emily said nothing, just clutched the photo of her father tightly, as if it were the only real thing she had left. "I'm sorry," she whispered as they moved away. "I'm sorry I made you lose your job." "You did nothing wrong," David replied firmly. "Absolutely nothing." Behind them, David could hear Karen ordering the other employees back to work. But he also heard something else, old Joe arguing loudly with Richard Anderson. "You know very well that girl is your daughter," the doorman was saying. "How can you pretend not to know her?" "Shut up, Joe," Richard shouted back. "You're fired too." "Fire me if you want," old Joe replied. "But I won't stay silent in the face of this injustice. That child isn't to blame for what happened." David stopped pushing the wheelchair. There was something about that conversation that intrigued him. "What happened?" He turned and called out to old Joe. "What's this about?" But Richard was already entering the building, and Karen was pushing old Joe away. "Come find me after work," old Joe managed to shout to David before being forced to step back. "I need to tell you something." David nodded and kept pushing Emily toward the street. When they reached the sidewalk, she finally spoke. "He hates me," she said simply. "I don't believe that." "You saw. He didn't even look at me properly. He must be ashamed to have a daughter like me." David stopped the wheelchair and knelt in front of her. "Listen carefully to what I'm about to say," he told her, looking straight into her eyes. "There's nothing wrong with you, nothing. If anyone is ashamed, that's their problem, not yours. But I'm different. I can't walk. I can't do the things other kids do." "So what?" David interrupted. "You're smart, brave, determined. Look at the courage you had to come here looking for your father. How many kids your age would have that strength?" Emily gave a small smile for the first time. "You really think so?" "I'm sure of it." At that moment, an old noisy car stopped in front of them. A middle-aged woman rushed out, her face flushed and hair disheveled. "Emily! Oh my God, I've been looking for you all morning," she shouted, running toward the girl. "Mrs. Martha." Emily lowered her head, clearly feeling guilty. "Where were you? I woke up and you weren't home." I was frantic. David watched the interaction between the two. Martha seemed genuinely worried but also exhausted. There was something in her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. "And you are?" Martha asked, eyeing David with suspicion. "David Johnson. I worked at the factory over there. I found Emily in the yard and was helping her." "Oh," Martha sighed. "She came looking for her father again, didn't she?" "Again?" "It's the third time this month," Martha explained, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know what to do anymore. Every time I leave for work or go to the market, she sneaks off to come here." David looked at Emily, who had lowered her head again. "Why didn't you tell me this?" he asked gently. "Because you'd think I was annoying like everyone else," she murmured. Martha sighed again and stepped closer to the wheelchair. "Emily, how many times have I explained that your father, that the situation is complicated?" "But I just want to talk to him once," Emily said, her eyes filling with tears again. "Just once." David felt his heart break. He looked at Martha, who seemed to be struggling with her own emotions. "Mrs. Martha," he said quietly, "can I ask you something? Why can't her father see her?" Martha hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might be listening. It's a long story," she finally said. "I have time." Martha looked at Emily, then back at David. "Not here," she said. "Not in front of the factory. If you really want to know, you can come by our house tonight. But I should warn you, it's a sad story." David nodded. "That's fine. What's the address?" Martha gave him the address in the Riverside neighborhood, a modest part of town David knew well. They agreed he would come by at 8 that evening. "Now let's go home, Emily," Martha said, helping the girl into the adapted car. "And do you promise not to run off again?" Emily looked at David before answering. "You're really coming to our house tonight?" "Yes, I am." "Then I promise," she told Martha, but her eyes stayed on David. "Thank you for being kind to me." "Thank you for showing me what really matters," David replied, surprising himself with the sincerity of his answer. After they left, David stood still on the sidewalk staring at the factory where he had worked for the past 5 years. Suddenly, the whole routine seemed meaningless. He had lost his job, but he had gained something far more valuable, the certainty that he had done the right thing. He was about to leave when he heard someone calling his name. It was Mike, the welder who had recorded the argument. "David, wait up!" The younger man ran toward him, phone in hand. "Dude, you gotta see this," he said out of breath. "The video already has over 1,000 views." "What video?" "The one I took of the mess. I posted it on my profile, and everyone's sharing it. People are furious about how the girl was treated." David took the phone and watched the video. It clearly showed the girl crying, David defending her, Karen being aggressive, and especially the moment Richard completely ignored his daughter. "Mike, are you sure you want to get involved in this? It could cost you your job." "It already did," Mike shrugged. "Karen fired me 5 minutes after you left. Said it was for inciting trouble." David shook his head, feeling guilty. "Man, I'm sorry. I didn't want you to get hurt because of me." "It wasn't because of you," Mike corrected. "It was for the girl. I wouldn't be able to sleep at night knowing I stayed quiet while a child was mistreated." At that moment, other workers began leaving the factory. It was lunchtime. David recognized several faces and noticed many were heading his way. "David!" Sarah from cleaning waved at him. "Is it true you got fired for defending a child?" "It's true," he confirmed. "That's outrageous," said another worker David knew by sight. "Everyone inside is talking about it. Karen really lost it." "And is it true the girl is the boss's daughter?" asked an older woman from accounting. David hesitated. He wasn't sure if he should confirm that. "According to her, yes," he said carefully. "I knew it," Sarah said. "I always thought there was something odd about that story. Old Joe sometimes gets this really sad look, like he knows some heavy secret." "Where is Old Joe?" David asked. "He got fired too," the accounting woman informed him. Karen let him go on the spot, but before leaving he said something strange. "What?" "He said the truth always comes out, and some people will have to answer for what they did in the past." David felt a chill. There was much more to this story than he had imagined. "Everyone," he said to the group, "I appreciate your support, but I don't want anyone getting hurt because of me. It's not worth losing your job over this." "David," Sarah stepped closer and lowered her voice, "there's something you need to know. Karen isn't acting alone in all this." "What do you mean?" "She gets specific orders about how to handle certain situations, if you know what I mean." David didn't fully understand, but he stored the information away. It was clear there were far more secrets at Liberty Steel Works than he had ever imagined. The group of workers began to disperse when they saw Karen approaching the main building. Before leaving, Sarah whispered something in David's ear. "Old Joe's address is Blossom Street, 127. If you want to know the truth, you'd better talk to him before it's too late." David thanked her and decided he would look for Old Joe before going to Emily and Martha's house. He needed to understand what was really happening. The walk to Blossom Street took about 20 minutes. It was an old neighborhood with simple but well-kept houses. Number 127 was a small, light blue house with a little garden out front. David knocked on the door and waited. After a few seconds, heavy footsteps approached. "Who is it?" came Old Joe's voice from the other side. "It's me, David, the mechanic from the factory." The door opened immediately. Old Joe looked like he had aged 10 years since that morning. "David, come in, I was hoping you'd come." The house was simple but cozy. Old Joe led him to the living room, where several photos hung on the wall. David noticed many were of the factory at different times, showing employees and events over the years. "Have a seat," Old Joe said, pointing to the sofa. "Want some coffee?" "No, thank you. Old Joe, I need to understand what's going on. Who is that girl, really? Old Joe sighed and sat in an old armchair. Emily is Richard Anderson's daughter, that's true, but the story of how we got here is complicated. I have time. Richard wasn't always like this, David. When he was younger, he was a different man. Cheerful, generous, caring about his workers. He married Jennifer, a wonderful woman, and they were very happy. Old Joe paused to take a sip of water before continuing. When Emily was born, Richard was the proudest father you could imagine. He was always showing her pictures to everyone, talking about her non-stop. That girl was the light of his life. What happened? Emily was 3 when the accident happened. David felt his stomach tighten. What accident? It was a Sunday. Richard had promised to take her bike riding in the park. But at the last minute, a problem came up at the factory, and he said he had to handle it urgently. Jennifer was upset but let him go. Old Joe took a long pause, clearly reluctant to go on. Emily was heartbroken because her father broke his promise. Jennifer tried to comfort her, but the girl started crying uncontrollably. To distract her, Jennifer decided to bake a cake, Emily's favorite. David was already starting to imagine what came next. While Jennifer was mixing the batter, Emily tried to help by climbing onto a chair to reach the ingredients. The chair tipped over and she fell, hitting her back on the edge of the kitchen counter. Oh God. The injury was to her spine. The doctors did everything they could, but she never walked again. David closed his eyes, feeling a deep ache in his chest. And Richard? How did he react? He blamed himself completely, said if he'd kept his promise, if he'd taken her to the park like he said, none of this would have happened. He fell into a terrible depression. But it wasn't his fault. Try telling him that. Old Joe shook his head. Jennifer tried, we all tried, but Richard was consumed by guilt. He started working obsessively, as if he could punish himself through work. And Jennifer. Jennifer was suffering terribly too. She blamed herself just as much as Richard did, said she should have watched Emily more closely, shouldn't have let her climb that chair. They were both shattered, but each retreated into their own grief. Old Joe stood and walked to the window. The marriage couldn't take it. They separated when Emily was 5. Jennifer took the girl and moved to another neighborhood. Richard buried himself even deeper in work and slowly became the cold man you know today. But he kept supporting them financially. Yes, Richard always sent money for all of Emily's expenses, doctors, physical therapy, the wheelchair, everything. But he never wanted to see his daughter in person again. David was processing all this when something didn't add up. Old Joe, if Jennifer took Emily when she was 5, why is she living with Mrs. Martha now? Old Joe's face grew even sadder. Jennifer passed away 6 months ago, cancer. Richard paid for all the treatments, the best doctors, but it didn't help. And even then, he didn't go to the funeral. Jesus. The girl lost her mother 6 months ago. She did. And since Jennifer had no family, Emily went to live with Martha, who was a neighbor and family friend. Martha is a good woman, but she has her own problems. She works as a house cleaner and can barely support herself, let alone care for a child with special needs. David understood then why Emily was so desperate to find her father. She had lost her mother and was living in a precarious situation, unable to understand why her father rejected her. And does Richard know Jennifer passed away? He does. He even increased the child support he sends for Emily, but he still refuses to see her. That's just too cruel. David, Old Joe turned to him, I've worked at that factory for 20 years. I've seen Richard in every moment. When he ignored Emily today, I saw the pain on his face. He's not a monster. He's a broken man who thinks he doesn't deserve his daughter's love. But he's destroying her life too. I know. That's why I need your help. David was surprised. My help? You were the first person in years who had the courage to stand up to both Karen and Richard for Emily's sake. That means something. But I don't even work there anymore. And even if I did, Richard made it clear he wants nothing to do with his daughter. Richard is lying to himself, and Karen, well, Karen has her own reasons for wanting to keep Emily away. What reasons? Old Joe hesitated. It's complicated to explain. Karen has always had an interest in Richard. Long before the separation, she sees Emily as an obstacle to her plans. David began to understand the complex dynamics of the situation. You mean Karen is romantically interested in Richard? Exactly. And she knows if Richard reconciles with his daughter, he might become the man he once was. A man who would never be interested in someone like her. That's why she treats Emily so poorly. That's why she does everything to keep father and daughter apart. And sadly, Richard is so lost in his own guilt, he doesn't even realize what's happening. David stayed silent for a few minutes, taking it all in. The situation was far more complicated than he'd imagined. "Old Joe," he finally said, "what can I do? I'm just an unemployed mechanic. You can do what no one else has. Show Richard he can still be a father. Today, when you stood up for Emily, I saw something shift in his face. For a second, he seemed to remember who he used to be. But how? He fired me. He won't even want to see me." "I have an idea," Old Joe said, a spark in his eyes. "But it'll take courage. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. 2 hours later, David was at the door of Martha and Emily's home. It was a small, simple house in a neighborhood that had clearly seen better days. The paint on the front was peeling, and laundry hung on a small sideline. Martha opened the door and invited him in. The house was clean and tidy, but David noticed many basic things were missing. The furniture was old and patched, and a smaller wheelchair leaned against the wall, likely one Emily had used when she was younger. "Emily," Martha called, "David came to visit us." The girl appeared in the living room, now wearing a light pink shirt with her hair in a ponytail. She looked happier than she had that morning. "You really came," she said, smiling for the first time since David had met her. "Of course I did. A promise is a promise." Martha made coffee, and the three of them sat at the small kitchen table. David noticed that Emily could move around the house easily, clearly already adapted to the environment. "Mrs. Martha," he began, "Old Joe told me about Jennifer. I'm so sorry." Martha sighed. "Jennifer was my best friend. When she got sick, I promised I'd take care of Emily as if she were my own daughter, but it hasn't been easy." "In what sense?" "Financially, mostly. The money her father sends is enough for basic needs, but Emily needs physical therapy, specialized doctors, and that costs a lot." David looked at Emily, who was fiddling with a small photo she'd taken from her pocket. It was the same photo she'd been holding that morning. "May I see?" he asked. Emily hesitated for a moment, then handed him the photo. It was an old picture of a much younger Richard embracing a beautiful, smiling woman. The two looked completely happy. "That's my mom," Emily said softly. "She always said my dad was the kindest man in the world, that he loved me more than anything." David felt his heart tighten. "And do you believe that?" "I want to, but today, when he didn't even look at me, I think my mum was wrong." "Emily," David returned the photo and leaned forward. "Can I tell you something?" She nodded. "Sometimes, when people are in a lot of pain inside, they do things that seem cruel, but it's really because they're afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid of hurting the people they love even more. Afraid of not being good enough." Martha was silently observing the conversation, clearly interested in David's approach. "But if he loves me," Emily asked, "why doesn't he want to see me?" David chose his words carefully. "Do you remember when you got hurt? The accident?" Emily nodded, her face tightening slightly. "I was little, but I remember some things. I remember wanting to help my mum bake a cake, and I remember my dad had promised to take me bike riding, but he had to work." "And how did you feel when he couldn't keep his promise?" "Sad. Really sad. Now imagine how your dad felt when he found out you got hurt. Imagine how much he blamed himself for not being with you that day." Emily's eyes widened. "You think he blames himself for my accident?" I think he blames himself so much that he can't even look at you without remembering that day. And that must hurt terribly, Martha interjected. David, did you talk to old Joe today? I did. He told me the whole story. Then you know Richard never got over the guilt, Martha sighed. Jennifer tried everything to make him understand it wasn't his fault, but she never could. And now, with Jennifer gone, David chose his words carefully, he must be feeling even worse. Why? Emily asked. Because now you only have him, and he must be terrified of letting you down again. Emily fell silent for a few minutes, clearly processing everything David had said. If that's the case, she finally said, I can tell him I don't blame him for the accident, that I understand it wasn't his fault. That would be a good conversation for you two to have, David agreed. But first, he needs to agree to have that conversation. And how do we do that? Martha asked. David hesitated. The idea old Joe had suggested was risky, but maybe it was the only way. I have an idea, he said finally, but it'll take courage from all of us. What idea? Emily asked eagerly. Tomorrow's Saturday. Richard always goes to the factory in the morning to catch up on work, and he's usually alone there without Karen to interfere. And? What if you showed up there, not as a visitor but as his daughter? What if you showed him you're not afraid of him, that you just want a chance to talk? Martha immediately shook her head. No, David, too risky. You saw how he reacted today. I know, but there were a lot of people watching today, a lot of pressure. Tomorrow would be different. What if he calls security? What if he's cruel to her? Then at least she'll know the truth, David said softly. Sometimes it's better to know a painful truth than to live with uncertainty that hurts every day. Emily had been very quiet during this whole conversation. Finally, she spoke. I want to try, she said, with a firmness that surprised even herself. Emily, Martha began. Mrs. Martha, I need to know. If my father really doesn't want me, I need to hear it from him, so I can move on. David admired the girl's maturity. At 12 years old, she was showing more courage than most adults. All right, Martha sighed, but I'm going with you. Actually, David said, I have a better idea. What if I came too? You? Martha looked surprised. But you were fired. If Richard sees you there... He can't fire me twice, David said with a wry smile. And maybe it'd be good to have someone neutral there, someone who can mediate if things get tense. You'd do that for us? Emily asked, her eyes shining. I would. In fact, I feel like it's the right thing to do. Martha still seemed hesitant. What if it all goes wrong? What if Richard gets even angrier? Mrs. Martha, David leaned forward. The way things are now is already bad for everyone. Richard is hurting, Emily is hurting, and you're stuck in the middle of a situation that shouldn't be your responsibility alone. Sometimes we have to take a risk to have a chance at making things better. Martha looked at Emily, who was clearly waiting for her approval. All right, she finally said. We'll try, but if it goes wrong, I don't know what we'll do next. It'll work, Emily said with a confidence she didn't even know she had. I feel like it'll work. David hoped she was right. They spent the rest of the evening planning how they'd approach him the next day. It was agreed that David would stop by their house at 9 in the morning, and then they'd go to the factory together. As David was leaving, Emily tugged at his sleeve. David, she said, thank you for everything. It's been a long time since someone believed in me like this. Emily, I believe in you because you're an amazing person. Don't ever forget that, no matter what happens tomorrow. On the way home, David couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. In less than 24 hours, his life had completely changed. He'd lost his job, but he'd gained a whole new perspective on what really mattered. When he got home, he found his own daughter, Olivia, doing homework at the kitchen table. She was 13, just a year older than Emily, but David had never realized how lucky she was to have a stable family. Dad, she said, looking up, how was work today? David hesitated. How could he explain to his daughter that he'd lost his job for standing up for a child? It was different, he said, sitting beside her. Olivia, can I ask you something? Sure. If I had to choose between my job and doing the right thing for a child who was being mistreated, what do you think I should do? Olivia stopped writing and looked at him curiously. Is this hypothetical, or did something happen? David smiled. His daughter was too sharp. Something happened. Then you did the right thing, right? She said, as if it were obvious. How can you be so sure? Because I know you, Dad. You always taught me that work is important, but that there are things more important than work. And taking care of children is one of them. David felt immense pride in his daughter. And if this means we'll have financial difficulties for a while, Olivia shrugged. We'll manage, we always have. Aren't you scared? Of what? She asked, genuinely confused. Dad, you're the hardest working person I know. You'll find another job, and in the meantime, we'll save. David hugged his daughter, grateful he'd raised someone so understanding and mature. Do you want to tell me what happened? She asked. David recounted the whole story, from meeting Emily to the plans for the next day. Olivia listened quietly, asking occasional questions. Dad, she said when he finished, do you think Richard might change his mind? I hope so. He's not a bad man, Olivia, just a man in a lot of pain who doesn't know how to handle it. And Emily? How is she dealing with all this? With far more maturity than I'd expect from a child her age. She's brave. Can I meet her someday? David considered the question. Was it a good idea? Maybe, he said. Let's see how things go tomorrow first. That night, David barely slept. He imagined every possible scenario for the next day's meeting. What if Richard was truly cruel to Emily? What if things got worse instead of better? But then he remembered the courage in the girl's eyes and how she'd said she needed to know the truth. Sometimes, the only way out was to move forward, even when the path was uncertain. The next morning, David woke early and dressed carefully. He wanted to make a good impression, to show he took the situation seriously. At 9 sharp, he knocked on Martha and Emily's door. Emily had dressed up specially for the occasion. She wore a light blue dress that brought out her eyes, and her blonde hair was tied back with a yellow ribbon. She looked nervous but determined. Ready? David asked. Ready, she replied, though her voice trembled slightly. Martha decided to come along, despite David suggesting it might be better if just he and Emily went. She felt responsible for the girl and didn't want her facing this situation without support. The walk to the factory was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. David mentally rehearsed what he'd say if Richard turned hostile. Martha wondered if it was a terrible mistake to expose Emily to another possible rejection, and Emily tried to picture what it would finally be like to have a real conversation with her father. When they arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars, including Richard's limousine. He's here, Emily said, pointing to her father's car. Remember what we talked about, David said gently. No matter what happens, you're an amazing person who deserves love. Emily nodded, took a deep breath, and they walked to the main entrance. The weekend security guard wasn't old Joe, but a younger man David didn't know. He eyed the group curiously. Excuse me, David said. The young lady would like to speak with Mr. Richard Anderson. Is he expecting you? The guard asked. Not exactly, David admitted, but it's a very important family matter. The guard hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. Look, he doesn't like being disturbed on Saturdays. Please, Emily said, and something in her voice made the man pause and look at her more closely. I'm his daughter. I just want 5 minutes to talk. The guard's eyes widened. Daughter? I didn't know Mr. Anderson had... He does, David confirmed, and it's time she met her father. After a few minutes of hesitation, the doorman decided to call Richard's office. Mr. Anderson, there's a girl down here who says she's your daughter. She wants to talk to you. David could hear Richard's agitated voice on the other end, but couldn't make out the words. Yes, sir, the doorman continued. She's with 2 people, a man and a woman. Yes, sir, understood. He hung up the phone and looked at them with a pitying expression. He said he doesn't want to see anyone, and that if you don't leave now, he'll call security. Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes. Mrs. Martha wrapped an arm around the girl's shoulders. "Let's go," Mrs. Martha said softly. "He's made his feelings clear." But David wasn't ready to give up. "Wait," he said to the doorman. "Can you call him again? Tell him I promise she'll leave if he just comes down for 5 minutes. 5 minutes to talk to his own daughter." Man, he was pretty clear. "Please, 5 minutes. If after that she never bothers him again, it's worth a try." The doorman looked at Emily, who was clearly fighting back tears. "Ah, damn it," he muttered and dialed again. "Mr. Anderson, look, the guy here is asking for just 5 minutes. Says if you come down just to talk, the girl promises not to bother you again." "What?" "I know, sir, but she's just a kid and—" The doorman was cut off by something Richard said on the other end. His expression changed. "Oh, I see. Yes, sir. I'll do that right away." He hung up and looked at them uncomfortably. "He's coming down," he finally said. "Really?" Emily asked, wiping her eyes. "Yeah. But he said to warn you, it's just so you understand once and for all that he wants no contact. That after this, he doesn't want to be bothered again." David felt a knot in his stomach. Richard was coming, but clearly not with good intentions. "Emily," he said, "are you sure you want to do this? It might be painful." "I'm sure," she replied, and there was a determination in her voice that even impressed David. They waited outside the main building. After about 5 minutes, the doors opened and Richard Anderson stepped out. He was dressed casually in jeans and a polo shirt, but still carried himself with a stiff, businesslike posture. When his eyes met Emily's, David saw the same pain he'd noticed the day before. For a moment, the mask of coldness almost slipped, but Richard quickly composed himself. "What do you want?" he asked, addressing David mostly and avoiding direct eye contact with Emily. "Dad," Emily said, her voice steadier than David expected. "I just want to talk to you." "I'm not your father," Richard replied automatically, though his voice trembled slightly. "Yes, you are," Emily countered, "and I can prove it." She pulled the photo from her pocket and showed it to him. "This is you with my mum, and I have the birth certificate with your name." Richard looked at the photo, and David saw his hands shake. That doesn't mean anything," he said, but his voice was losing its firmness. "It means you loved me once," Emily said, tears now in her eyes. "Mom always told me how happy you were when I was born, how you'd spend hours rocking me to sleep. Your mother is lying," Richard managed to say, though it was clear the words cost him dearly. "My mother is dead," Emily said simply. The effect of those words on Richard was devastating. Even as he tried to maintain his composure, he swayed slightly as if struck physically. When?" he asked before he could stop himself. 6 months ago. Cancer. She was in the hospital a long time, but in the end, it was no use." Richard closed his eyes and took several deep breaths. I knew she was sick. I paid for all the treatments." "I know," Emily said softly. "She always said you still cared about us, even from afar." "And who are you living with now?" Richard asked, finally looking directly at Martha. "With Mrs. Martha," Emily replied. "She was my mum's friend. She takes really good care of me, but she's not my dad, and I really miss having a father." Richard was visibly struggling with his emotions. David could see the internal battle playing out on his face. "Emily," Richard finally said, and it was the first time David had heard him say his daughter's name. "You don't understand. I hurt you. If I had stayed home that day, if I had taken you to the park like I promised, none of this would have happened." "Dad," Emily said, and this time Richard didn't correct her. "I don't blame you for the accident. You should blame me. Why? You didn't push me out of the chair. You didn't want me to get hurt. It was just an accident. But if I had stayed with you, if you had stayed, maybe the accident would have happened differently, or maybe not. We'll never know, but it doesn't matter now." Richard's eyes were filled with tears, clearly fighting not to cry in front of everyone. "It does matter," he said. "It matters because of me. You'll never walk again." You'll never be able to do the things other kids do." "Dad," Emily said, her voice full of a patience and wisdom that seemed far beyond her 12 years. "I can do plenty of things. I can study. I can draw. I can sing. I can make friends. The wheelchair doesn't stop me from living. But what stops me from living is not having my dad. It's not knowing if you love me. It's having to wonder if I did something wrong to make you leave." Those words completely shattered Richard's resistance. He sobbed and for the first time in 9 years, knelt before his daughter. "Emily," he said through tears, "I love you so much it hurts. I love you so much I couldn't even look at you without remembering how I failed as a father." "You didn't fail," she said, reaching out to touch his face. "You're my dad, and I just wanted my dad back." Richard finally hugged her, and father and daughter cried together as David, Martha, and even the doorman watched with tearful eyes. "I'm sorry," Richard whispered. "I'm sorry for being so cowardly. I'm sorry for leaving you alone when you needed me most." "It's okay," Emily said, stroking her father's hair. "You're here now, that's all that matters." They stayed embraced for several minutes. When they finally pulled apart, Richard turned to Martha. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "Thank you for taking care of her when I didn't have the courage to." "She's a special girl," Martha replied, "but I always knew she needed her father." Richard then looked at David. "And you," he said, "thank you for having the courage I didn't, for standing up for my daughter when I abandoned her." "Mr. Richard," David said, "I just did what any decent person would do." "No," Richard shook his head. "Lots of people walked past Emily yesterday and did nothing. You were the only one who cared. She deserved to be defended." "Yes, she did, and you lost your job because of it." David shrugged. "It was worth it." Richard was silent for a moment, clearly thinking about something. "David," he finally said, "would you like to come back to work at the factory? I'm not sure Karen would like that very much." "Karen was fired," Richard said flatly. "This morning. I found out she was, let's say, twisting some situations for her own benefit." David was surprised but didn't ask for details. "I'd appreciate it if you came back," Richard continued. "In fact, I'm thinking of creating a new position, human relations supervisor, someone to ensure all employees are treated with dignity and respect." It would be an honor," David replied. "Great. You can start on Monday." Emily was radiant, seeing her new friend rewarded for his kindness. "Dad," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. Would you like to have lunch with us today? Mrs. Martha makes a delicious roast chicken." Richard looked at Martha, who nodded with a smile. "I'd love to," he said. "But first, there's something I need to do." "What?" "I need to call my lawyer. I want to make your custody official. You're my daughter, and you should be living with me." Martha looked worried. "Richard, I don't mind continuing to care for her." "Martha, you're a wonderful person, and I hope you'll always be part of Emily's life. But she needs to come home. Home with me." Emily was practically glowing with happiness. "Really, Dad? I'll live with you." "If you want. We'll have to adapt the house, make some changes to make it more accessible for you. But yes, I want you to come live with me." "I want to!" she shouted, throwing her arms around his neck. David watched the whole scene with deep satisfaction. In less than 48 hours, he had witnessed a complete transformation. A father and daughter who had been lost to each other had found their way back. "Well," Richard said, standing up, "how about we go to that lunch? I have 9 years of conversations to catch up on with my daughter. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. The lunch at Martha's house was an eye-opening experience for everyone. Richard, who had lived isolated in his world of work and guilt for years, rediscovered the joy of talking with his daughter. Emily, in turn, finally had the chance to know her father as he truly was, not as the distant figure she had imagined. "Dad," Emily said during dessert, "can I see where you work? I mean, inside." "Of course," Richard smiled. "Actually, I have an idea. How about you visit the factory on Monday? You could meet all the employees. They won't be upset with me, after all that commotion yesterday." Upset? Richard laughed. Emily, half the employees are talking about how brave you were, and the other half are praising David for defending you. David was surprised. Really? Really? In fact, old Joe spent the whole morning calling me. Said he was proud to have worked for a company where decent people still exist. Old Joe was fired yesterday, David reminded him. And rehired this morning, Richard said. With a raise too. 20 years of loyal service deserves recognition. After lunch, Richard insisted they go to his house so Emily could see where she'd be living. It was a large mansion in an upscale neighborhood with well-kept gardens and a pool. It's so big, Emily commented, looking slightly intimidated. It's been empty for a long time, Richard admitted. It'll be good to have life here again. They spent the whole afternoon planning the necessary adaptations, ramps, grab bars in the bathroom, rearranging furniture. Richard was clearly excited at the prospect of having his daughter live with him. Dad, Emily said when they were in what would be her new room, can I bring some things from Mrs. Martha's house? Of course. In fact, how about we bring everything today? Today? Why wait? I want you to feel at home as soon as possible. Martha, who had accompanied them, seemed a little sad at the prospect of losing Emily's company, but clearly happy to see her reunited with her father. Martha, Richard said, noticing her expression, I hope you'll continue to be a constant presence in Emily's life. She'll need you, and so will I. I know nothing about raising a 12-year-old girl. It would be my pleasure, Martha smiled, and if you need help with anything, just call. Actually, Richard hesitated, I'd like to make you an offer. What offer? How about coming to work for me? As, well, a housekeeper, caregiver, whatever you think best, with a fair salary, of course. Martha was stunned. Richard, That's very generous, but... It's not generosity, he interrupted. It's necessity. Emily needs stability, and you're already part of her life. Besides, I work a lot and will need help raising her properly. Can I think about it? Of course. No pressure. That night, when everything was settled and Emily was asleep in her new room, Richard called David into the office to talk. David, he began, I want you to know that today was the most important day of my life in the past 9 years. I'm glad you two found each other again. It wouldn't have happened without you. If you hadn't stood up for Emily yesterday, if you hadn't persisted. Mr. Richard, any father who loves his daughter would have done the same. Ah, but that's where you're wrong, Richard said sadly. I wasn't being a father, I was being a coward, and you showed me the difference. They talked for another hour, with Richard sharing more details about his years of suffering and isolation, and David recounting his own experiences as a father. You know what amazes me most about all this? Richard said as they said goodbye. What? Emily's maturity. At 12, she had more courage than I did in 9 years. More wisdom, too. She's a special girl. Yes, and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for lost time. On Monday, when David returned to work, he was greeted as a hero by his co-workers. The story of how he had defended Emily and helped reconcile father and daughter had spread throughout the factory. David, old Joe greeted him at the entrance. How was your weekend? Productive, David smiled. And yours? The best in years. Seeing Richard and Emily together again, it was like watching a family reborn. That morning, Richard showed up at the factory with Emily as promised. The girl was radiant, clearly proud to be there with her father. Everyone, Richard announced to the gathered employees, I'd like to introduce my daughter, Emily. And I also want to apologize for my behavior these past few days. Sometimes our personal pain makes us act in ways unworthy of who we are. The employees applauded, and many came forward to greet Emily. She spoke to everyone naturally, curious about what each person did at the factory. David, she said when she reached him, thank you again, for everything. No need to thank me. I'm the one who learned from you. Learned what? That sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply be ourselves and never give up on what's right. In the months that followed, the transformation was remarkable. Richard became a present and dedicated father, making up for lost years with attention and affection. Emily flourished in her new life, making friends at school and engaging in various activities. Martha accepted Richard's offer and moved into the mansion, not as an employee, but as part of the extended family. She and Richard developed an efficient partnership in raising Emily, each contributing their particular strengths. David thrived in his new position, implementing policies that made Liberty Steelworks a model of humane and dignified treatment for employees. Richard, inspired by his daughter's courage, became a more compassionate and present businessman. But perhaps the most significant change was in Richard himself. He rediscovered not only his love for his daughter but also for himself. The guilt he had carried for years was gradually replaced by gratitude. Gratitude for getting a second chance, for having such a special daughter, and for having people around him willing to help him find his way back home. A year after their reunion, the family threw a party to celebrate Emily's 13th birthday. The house was full of friends, schoolmates, factory workers who had grown close to the family, and members of the community whom Emily had touched with her joy and determination. During the party, Richard gave a speech. "A year ago," he said, "I was a lost man. I had lost touch with everything that truly mattered in life, but my daughter, with her courage and unconditional love, brought me back home." He looked at David, who was in the audience with his own family. "And I have to thank a man who had the courage to do what I didn't, stand up for my daughter when she needed it most. David, thank you for showing me the kind of man I should be." David was moved, but what touched him most was seeing the genuine happiness on Emily's face. The girl he had found crying in the factory yard was now surrounded by love and acceptance. "Dad," Emily said when it was her turn to speak, "thank you for having the courage to be my father again. And thank you for teaching me that sometimes we lose the people we love, but if we have faith and don't give up, we can find them again." She looked at the photo of her mother, which now had a place of honor in their new home. "Mom," she said to the photo, "we did it. Daddy came home." There wasn't a dry eye in the house. Later that night, when the guests had left and Emily was asleep, Richard and David sat in the garden, gazing at the stars. "You know what I think sometimes?" Richard said. "What?" "That maybe Jennifer sent you to help us. I know it sounds silly, but—" "It doesn't sound silly," David interrupted. "Sometimes I believe the people we love find ways to look after us, even when they're no longer here." "Do you think she's proud of how Emily turned out?" "I'm sure she is, and I'm sure she's proud of you too, of the man you've become again." Richard nodded, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. "David," he said, "thank you for everything, for giving me my daughter back, for giving me my life back." "Richard, I just did what was right. The credit is all yours and Emily's. You both had the courage to forgive and start over. Still, thank you." They sat in silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. "You know something?" Richard finally said. "What?" "For the first time in years, I'm looking forward to waking up tomorrow, to seeing what new adventure Emily will bring me." David smiled. "That's what it feels like to truly be a father. It is, and I'll never forget that again." 2 years later, Liberty Steelworks had become one of the most respected companies in the region, not just for its efficiency, but especially for its exemplary treatment of employees. Richard had implemented several innovative policies, including a support program for workers with disabled family members. Emily, now 15 years old, had become a young activist visiting schools and businesses to talk about inclusion and overcoming challenges. Her story with her father had become a local legend, inspiring other families to overcome their own difficulties. David, in turn, had been promoted to Human Resources Director, and under his leadership, the factory had become a model of a healthy and respectful workplace. Martha still lived with Richard and Emily, but now her role had evolved into much more than a caregiver. She had become a sort of household manager and confidant to both, a cornerstone of the family structure they had built. One Sunday afternoon, the family was gathered in the garden when Emily made an announcement. "Dad, I've decided what I want to do when I grow up." "What?" Richard asked, curious. "I want to be a psychologist, specializing in helping families who've gone through trauma." "Why?" "Because I know what it's like when people drift apart because of pain, and I also know how good it feels when they find their way back to each other. I want to help other families reconnect. Richard felt his eyes well up with tears of pride. I think that's a wonderful choice, he said. You'll make a difference in so many people's lives. I hope so. And when I graduate, I want you and David to help me open a clinic, a place where families can come when they feel lost. It would be an honor, Richard replied, and David, who was there, nodded enthusiastically. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Richard called David. Did you hear what she said today? I did. She's going to be an amazing psychologist. You know what amazes me the most? What? She wants to turn our experience into something that can help others. At 15, she already understands that our pain can be used to lessen someone else's. She's always been special. Yeah. And to think I almost missed my chance to be her father. But you didn't, David reminded him. That's what matters. You're right. And I'll never take that chance for granted again. 5 years later, Emily was graduating with a degree in psychology. Richard, David, and Martha sat in the front row at the graduation ceremony, proud of the determined and compassionate young woman she had become. In her commencement speech, Emily was chosen to represent her class. 8 years ago, she began, I was a lost girl who thought I'd never have a real family. Today I'm here not just because I had the support of extraordinary people, but because I learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice. It's about people who decide to stand by you, no matter how hard the road gets. She looked at Richard, David, and Martha in the audience. My father taught me it's never too late to start over. That true love can overcome any past mistake. David taught me that we must have the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs us dearly. And Martha taught me that sometimes the angels we need come disguised as ordinary people, willing to open their hearts to strangers. She paused, emotion thickening her voice. As a psychologist, I promise to use everything I've learned to help other families reconnect. Because I believe everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone deserves to be loved. And everyone deserves someone who believes in them, even when they've lost faith in themselves. The audience erupted in applause. Richard wept openly, uncaring who saw. David stood clapping, immensely proud of the young woman he'd first met as a crying girl in a factory yard. After the ceremony, as they celebrated at a restaurant, Emily made another announcement. Dad, I found the perfect place for our clinic. Our clinic? The clinic we're going to open together. You, me, David, and anyone else who wants to help. A place where families can come when they're broken and need mending. Richard looked at David, who nodded enthusiastically. When do we start? Richard asked. Tomorrow, if you want, Emily laughed. I have 8 years of plans to make up for. And so, a year later, Hope Family Clinic opened its doors. It was a special place run by a young psychologist who deeply understood the pain of family separation, supported by a father who had learned the value of forgiveness, and by a man who had discovered that doing the right thing is always worth it. The clinic quickly became a cornerstone of the town. Families torn apart by resentment, misunderstandings, or simply the difficulty of communicating found a safe space to reconnect. Richard, who now split his time between the factory and the clinic, discovered a new passion in helping others. David, who had become a partner in the clinic, used his life experience to guide fathers struggling to reconnect with their children. And Emily, at 22, was already recognized as one of the most promising young psychologists in the region. But more important than any professional recognition was the fact that she had transformed her own painful experience into a source of healing for others. One sunny morning, exactly 8 years after their first meeting in the factory yard, Richard and Emily were in the clinic's garden when a woman approached, holding a child in her arms. "Excuse me," the woman said hesitantly, "do you handle cases of family reconciliation?" "Of course," Emily replied with a warm smile. "That's our specialty. It's just, my husband and I have been separated for 2 years. He thinks he doesn't deserve to be a father because of mistakes he made in the past, but our daughter misses him and I know he loves her." Richard and Emily exchanged a meaningful glance. "You've come to the right place," Richard said gently. We understand exactly what you're going through. You do? More than you think, Emily replied. And I can promise you one thing. It's never too late for a family to come back together. No matter how much pain there is, no matter how much time has passed, true love always finds a way. As they walked into the clinic, Richard held his daughter's hand for a moment. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For never giving up on me. For believing I could be the father you deserved." "Dad," Emily smiled, "you've always been the father I deserved. You just needed to realize it." And so, what had begun as a story of separation and pain became one of hope and second chances. A story that continued to be written every day, each time a new family found their way back home. The end. Now tell me, what did you think of this story of resilience and family love? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to find the courage to stand up for someone more vulnerable? What if more people had the same attitude as David? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartwarming stories like this one. Your participation makes all the difference.